Okay, I am Dr. Ignacio Palacios, and I teach the composition and literature and ESL classes here at LETU. And so I'm going to talk to you just briefly about reasonable expectations for ESL writing. Sometimes professors are a bit, confused or concerned because all of a sudden they have an ESL student in their classroom and they say, now what do I do here? So I'm just going to give you a few ideas, not a thorough class on error correction and things like that. No, not at all. Just what to expect from that kind of a student. So reasonable, and I chose that word carefully, reasonable expectations. We know that they are second language writers. They're not going to be native. We know that much. So they're not going to have a copy of whatever a native speaker would be writing. They're not going to be that way. And probably even through graduate school, they probably never will. So we need to remember that from the very start. So we have to have some reasonable expectations for ESL writers. We know, of course, that English is an international language. It is the language of commerce, of travel, and things like that. And there are multiple varieties of English. We have English in India, we have English in Australia, we have English in England, in Canada, in the US. So not one country owns English. Sometimes we as Americans tend to think, oh, they ought to speak like I do. And really, what about the other English speakers, Singapore or something else, somewhere else? So not one country owns it. So we have to remember that. And when we read papers from second language writers, must remember that they have some leeway. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute too. Because there are more speakers of ESL or EFL than native speakers in the world. 3 out of 4 are speakers of English are second language or foreign language speakers. So there are more who are learners of English who speak English. 3 out of 4. Also, 4 out of 5 teachers of English in the world, we are second language speakers. Okay? So 4 out of 5. So we outnumber those who consider themselves native speakers and native teachers. So we have to remember that from the very start. So who are we? Non-native speakers are the majority, so who are we to say this is the way it should be? Maybe not. Maybe they're the ones that tell us how it should be. Because English is a changing language, in case you didn't know. It changes all of the time. So our main ideas here is that college professors may become frustrated, especially when receiving writing from second language learners. So we need to deal with some of that frustration today. The instructors need to know, first of all, there's a distinction between native and non-native student writing. There's also a distinction between remedial, or those students who have gone through the process of native language learning and somehow didn't get the right writing, and they are now using remedial, or what we call in this college writing. We put it in there because they need extra help. But they're not the same. Second language writers are not the same. Also, we need to have some reasonable expectations, especially when we receive this kind of writing from second language writers. And the main thing is to lessen misunderstandings. If we come with the understanding that they're not going to be the same, and they are going to have problems, but the problems may be the same and or different from remedial writers. And that's very, very important. So I think with having this kind of an understanding, we can have greater empathy for the second language writers. So we're going to look at native versus non-native writer. The native writers usually, of course, have an intuitive knowledge because they've come with a language from childhood. And so they already know how they're supposed to be expressing orally. They may need some help in the written variety, but they already have this intuitive language. They have years of cultural and linguistic background. And they have usually a Western rhetorical tradition of ways of expression. And we're going to see that non-native speakers may have different traditions from non-Western ways of expression. That can make a difference in the way they present their ideas, they develop their thoughts, their essays, their paragraphs, things like that. And then they also, native speakers rely on explicit language, independent of context. That is, within the context, let's say the paragraph or the essay, they say everything they're supposed to say so that the reader understands everything that they want to convey. That's usually the way it works, especially with Western languages. But non-native, of course, don't have the intuitive knowledge. They don't come with these years of background in the language and in the culture. So they don't have this already in their mind, and they have non-Western rhetorical traditions and ways of expression. They have other ways of relaying information. And they rely on implicit language, very context dependent. That is, they think that right outside there should be messages. Outside of the written word, there are messages that should tell us what the written word means. And within our culture, we should understand what that means. So, for instance, the Asian students or Chinese speakers can write an essay and never tell you the main idea. And they just imply it, or they let you infer it. And they say, well, aren't you intelligent enough to understand what my main thought is? And that's really the way the Chinese will see it. And Hispanics, for instance, Spanish speakers, Latin Americans, sometimes will go from one idea to another, and they go kind of in a zigzag direction instead of a linear Western traditional direction. So we need to understand this. So native writers are distinct. They can communicate at various levels in the skills. They expect a shared background knowledge. We know the background information, therefore the written page tells you what they need to know, and then you infer a lot of ideas because of the common culture. They may, especially if they are substandard or non-standard writers, may have writing that doesn't meet quite like the 8 or the subject-verb agreement, or maybe they write in fragments and things like that, because they are perhaps the non-standard variety writers. Also, they're not too concerned perhaps about usage, because they know they can easily be understood. They may use the wrong word, but they say, do you know what I mean? And yeah, we do, because we understand the same language, and so they just take a lot of things for granted. They also understand the academic discourse communities. They know what is expected. For instance, sometimes I have to tell my students when they're writing, even like if they're using a sheet of paper, not computer, just a sheet of paper writing something, sometimes I just have to explain to them, look, in a loose leaf notebook paper, this is considered the front of the paper, this is considered the back of the paper. Those are kind of unwritten rules that we take for granted, but sometimes I just have to tell them, look, when you write like this and the holes are over here, you seem to indicate that you don't know that this is the way it's done in the US. So do it this other way, with the holes over here. That's just a simple, a non-written rule, unwritten rules of discourse communities. So they may, the native speakers already understand those kinds of things. And they are easily bothered by unconventional ways of expression, which are difficult to decipher. So this is true of native writers. And now, ESL and basic writers. The ESL, according to LETU, she discusses several similarities and differences between ESL writers and basic writers. And I recommend her book in case you ever want to. It's called Understanding ESL Writers by Becky, and it's going to be in my bibliography. And also, I think someone said, Colin Halupa said that everything's going to be available online somewhere for you to access, even the lectures. So that will be there too. But she says the strategies that work with standard English as a second dialect students cannot simply be assumed to work with ESL students. In other words, they are a different group. They're not going to be just the same because they don't have that intuitive knowledge. When we say, write what sounds right, well, for them, this sounds right. So that's the way they write it, because that's their knowledge. And there are also a lot of sociolinguistic, psychological, cross-cultural differences when it comes to the ESL writers as opposed to basic writers. So the appeal to native intuition, to what sounds right, doesn't always work with the second language writer. Sometimes you just have to be very, very explicit and say, well, a native writer would say probably like this, or reword it and say, is this what you mean? Like when I have conferences with my ESL students, sometimes they'll come to my office and they write some sentence and I say, okay, can you tell me in your own words what you mean right here, what you have written? And sometimes as they try to explain, I say, oh, do you mean this? And they say, yes, yes. I say, well, just write just what you told me. So they have to rewrite what they have thought they have told me. So trying to convey that message. So the basic writing versus ESL writing. Basic writers, they're learning a different standard, what we call the standard written English variety. They're also native English speakers usually, and they may come from non-standard dialects. The teachers may or may not be trained in ESL. They may be inexperienced in standard English. They may have lower self-esteem. That usually goes kind of hand in hand, an identity with language, like I can't always write, so ooh, I'm not good. Something like they kind of equate those kinds of things together. They may use a lot of informal writing. They may assume, of course, a lot of native, intuitive knowledge, and sometimes they may be considered, quote, illiterate because they don't know just the standard variety. ESL writer, they are learning the standard written English also. And they come from other languages. They're not native speakers to the language. They have many other kinds of languages. A lot of the ones that I teach here at the university, for instance, English is not just their second language, but it may be their third or their fourth or whatever language. So we call it ESOL, English for speakers of other languages, because sometimes they have lots of languages in their mind that they're dealing with, and English is just one of them. They might also be experienced in other language writing. They may be very good writers in their language, and they're just having to get the standards for written variety of English. They also may have higher self-esteem because they are accomplished individuals. Many times, having gone through the process of many language learning, they feel very confident, like, yes, I can do this, Just tell me how and I'll plug it in, Something like that. But they have very good self-esteem, and they may use formal, that is very different also. They may use very formal writing because they have been taught perhaps in their country, this is the way the English speakers will write, and so they avoid informal varieties. They just want to be very, very, very formal. And they can become a little awkward sometimes because of that. And they cannot assume native English understanding or native intuition, and may or may not be illiterate. So sometimes a lot of the ones that we get in the university are already very literate in their language, and even the second and third language, and they're getting English as another way of becoming literate. So they are multi-literate people. The ESL writer strategies, they may use different strategies in reading and revising. For instance, some of the ones that I deal with sometimes will write their first draft maybe in their native language. Of course, I cannot read in their native language, if it's Chinese or Russian or something else, but I do allow them, if it's for their own benefit, for drafting, for free writing, go ahead and do it if that's what works for you. And then if you have to transfer it into the second language, go ahead. So they may have a different strategy. Also, whereas the basic students may use a lot of contextual top-down processing, they say, look at the whole and then work with the parts. The second language writer may actually be looking at the parts to make sense of the whole. So they look from the bottom-up process, and they work a little bit differently. Finally, many researchers have claimed that technical grammar instruction, and I may be stepping on some toes, but because I have colleagues here, but they may think that, no, don't teach grammar. Well, I disagree, especially with second language learners. It is important to touch base upon certain things that they need to be able to get in their language, that is the standard variety they're trying to learn. So it is important to touch base on grammar. Again, I may be stepping on some toes because there's been a terrible discussion in the English comp field that, grammar doesn't help, grammar doesn't help. Well, okay, I'm a different person, I think it does help. But there are some misconceptions, nonetheless. Sometimes they're viewed as less than intelligent because they have a second language. They are not as brilliant or not as smart simply because they're working with a second language. Well, some of them may even have their degree already. Like I had one student particularly, she had a master's degree already in her country, in Guatemala, and she was in my ESL class, and she was working as a custodial. I won't tell you who, but she's at the university here. But she has a master's degree in business in her country. But she's working as a custodian at this university simply because English is her second language. So you see the big ladder they have to climb just to get where they were before. And some of them are like that. So they cannot be considered simply as less bright or less intelligent. They are not also just remedial students that, just like the others that need this, therefore will do the same. So they do need a special kind of treatment. Discourse communities, of course, it's important. Mitsuda, a writer in the field, says that he thinks that there should be a dynamic model, that is, there is a need for students to learn the discourse community of the second language, but readers of that second language should also understand that they're coming from a second language. So they should be prepared in their minds. They're not going to be saying it the same way. So I need to understand and read into what they're trying to say. And sometimes, like I said, in my conferences, I just ask the students, is this what you mean? If so, they tell me orally, and I said, now write it down the way you just told me. So they can tell me again what they are trying to say. So adjusting expectations. A reader of an ESL text must assume responsibility for adjusting those expectations when we're reading second language writing within the discourse community. And this view, of course, offers an alternative view that is, instead of thinking of them just remedial or just not smart, but just saying, okay, they come from a different language, let's see what they're trying to tell me. Let's see if I can understand. And conferencing a lot of times brings up those misunderstandings. If you just take the time to try to understand instead of tossing out the window and say, go to Dr. Palacios, see what he said. Which a lot of professors have found around here always say, Dr. Palacios, what shall I do? Oh, so I'm trying to give you some tips here. So reasonable expectations. Expect the following. For instance, in the rhetoric of Asian students, as I said before, a lot of them will favor consensual knowledge as opposed to individual opinion. So when we're telling them to do like an argument on this and that, they may say, but what does the expert, say? I'd rather tell you what the expert says rather than my opinion. Or what is the community or the society or the culture say about this issue? Also, sometimes leave out generalizations. As I mentioned before, my Chinese students will not give the main idea, but just give a bunch of examples and let the reader determine what does this mean. I had a Chinese student one time in Florida who, he was writing an essay, and I said, okay, we had a conference, and I said, okay, what is your main idea here? Can you point to your thesis statement? And he says, well, don't you understand it? Like, how dumb you are, you don't understand what I'm trying to say? Because from the Chinese, it's like all of these examples should lead you to make the right inference. The inference here is this. I said, okay, yeah, I think I know what you mean. I said, but not all readers will. So it's better for you to go ahead and put it in 1 or 2 or 3 words at least. Tell me what is your main point here. Tell me what you're trying to tell me here. And then Middle Eastern writers, a lot of times will emphasize a lot of flowery language, coordinated structures, a lot of balanced ideas. If you've read the book of Proverbs, you see that Middle Eastern type of balanced ideas, the good, the bad, the ugly, and all that stuff. And may provide examples. I'm more comfortable with open, with ideological or factual writing rather than open writing, open-ended free writing. And much more dealing with ideas or with facts. And they are more context dependent. That is, they're going to assume that everybody has the same shared knowledge. And of course, we have to tell them, well, I come from your background, so I don't understand what you're trying to tell me here simply because I don't have that background. You have to explain it. In the literature, we are told that English, for instance, is one of those languages that is very explicit. That means it wants to put everything out in the open and leave nothing to the imagination, whereas Chinese hides things and leaves things to your inference. So it's very different. It is very context dependent. And also, they assume, of course, shared backgrounds, understanding. Latin American writers may also embellish the language in many ways. If you have ever read in Spanish, like Cervantes, is very flowery. And a lot of people say, that is the ideal, and if you write like that, you're a good writer. And then when Spanish speakers come and write in English, and they want to write very flowery, teachers say, forget this, forget that, just tell me what you mean. It's like, well, this is the background they come from. This is why they embellish. There's a lot of similarities between Middle Eastern and Spanish speakers because the history of Spain, for instance, the Arabs were there for many years. Also, they may go in different directions. They don't just have a linear way of point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, conclusion, like we try to teach sometimes in English composition classes, because they go this way, this way, this way, like a pendulum, and then they get to their main thought. Even if you've ever gone to a Spanish church where a preacher is preaching, sometimes the preacher is saying, I'm going to talk about this, but then all of a sudden he's talking about that, and you say, does this have to do with that? And then he'll swing over here to this, and say, what? He was going to talk about this, now he's over there. And in English, in homiletics, they're called going to the rabbit trail, right? You go this way and that way. But in Spanish, that's the typical way of discourse, rhetorical, Spanish, Latin American discourse. So there are differences in the writing, and you may see that in the writing of ESL students. And then, of course, we have the typical structural or lexical types of errors. There may be confusion over countable and non-countable nouns. We take those for granted in English, and we say, you know, 1 chair, 2 chairs, and we count it because of the countable. But gasoline, flour, rice, they're non-count. But students may have confusion. For instance, they may say many homeworks instead of many assignments. I have many homeworks to do. Or much students in this class instead of many students. So they have the confusion between the determiner or the article usage and the noun itself. And then they have adjectives made into plurals. They may say like things like the youngs instead of the young people, or the young like to do this, or the olds. They may have article usage confusion, like the life is hard instead of life is hard, or we have a zero article, what's called in English, we just take it out. That's part of the English way of expression. And then confused verb forms, perhaps the progressive and the simple present, like I am reading the Bible every day, now I read Proverbs, where probably in the English we would say, I read the Bible every day, now I am reading Proverbs, because we made that distinction. So they may have that kind of confusion too. And then trouble with modals and or helping verbs. He can speak Spanish, or teacher, may you help me, instead of could you help me, or something like that. So this confusion of the modals, like adding the S to the can word, we don't have that in English. So those things are strict structural type of errors. The ESL students' backgrounds, they may have different expectations. They may be trained not to differ with teachers or have conflicting opinions, because that would be like impolite or immoral or questioning authority. So they always say, the teacher says it, yeah, even if they're in their hearts, I can't do it. But they're not going to express that. In the Japanese culture, especially, it's so that the thumb that sticks out gets the hammer. Because if they all of a sudden start standing up from the rest of the world, it's like a faux pas in their culture. They have different ideas about time. So that is something I have to work with constantly, because of course I'm working in an English-speaking environment. We have a schedule, and then my Arabic students decide. They come to class 5 minutes late. It's supposed to start at 1:55. I can't get it at 1:55 because 2 instead of 1:55. I said, well, it really starts at 1:55. And then here I am starting the class, and I gotta go get some coffee. So as if this were a party. It's a class. So those are things we have to remember too. And they may not like group work necessarily. They may not like that. We just have to train them to get used to group work. They may not understand that, of course, all the material that is being spoken in conversations and in lectures. They may also feel socially and culturally obligated to share knowledge with those that don't have the knowledge. And this is where a lot of this plagiarism may come in, because they think, I gotta help them. He doesn't know. Therefore, I gotta give them all the stuff. And this is the way they feel about getting ideas from sources. They think they have it, they're the knowledgeable ones, I'll get it from them. And so their idea of plagiarism is quite different, because theirs is a shared knowledge. They help, obligated to help. And sometimes they may come across as rude or offensive, especially like for professors when they come and say things like, teacher, help me with this, or teacher, give me the exam back, because I'm, wait a minute, this is not the way we come across with a teacher. So we have to teach them some of those kinds of behaviors. They're unwritten rules that we take for granted. Many times the ESL writers may have sophisticated culture and linguistic knowledge in their language. They're trying to express it in a second. Sometimes they come across with a tone of authority, like they know what they're saying, therefore we ought to believe what they said. They also may have a lot of unquestioning acceptance of their own ideologies. There couldn't be a second way. There couldn't be another way to look at this. This is just the way it is. This is the way it is. This is the way it was taught. Therefore, it's got to be the correct way. Also, the native culture and linguistic second language knowledge and experience is expected, or is to be seen, because they come from another one. So they have their native language and expressed in the second language. understanding. They're unaccustomed to writing about self. So sometimes those things like, write about the personal experience of what happened to you or whatever. They'll say, not really, I don't want to talk about me, let's talk about this subject or something else. A lot of times they have faulty understanding of topics assigned, so you have to go through with them and tell them, you understand what we're talking about. Can you tell me what you're supposed to do? You just answer, tell me, what did I just say? This is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're expected to do. And of course, quoting, paraphrasing without attribution or citation. And of course, sometimes meanings are lost in the translation. My tips for you would be to don't simply single them out as different or deficient. They already know they're different. Don't favor one ethnic group above another. You can never do that. And encourage small group. Try to teach them what it means to work in groups and pairs, things like this. Provide outlines on the board or on the PowerPoint. This is about the best thing you can do for any student, especially second language writers. If you always are out there talking without trying to put something on the board, they may get lost easily because they need all the meaning, all the skills, listening, reading, writing. Also, keep in mind different learning styles. Of course, that goes for any student, but not everyone is going to be in listening type of learner. They may be visual type of learners. And if you will, just do allow a little extra time, especially for in-class assignments, just as you would with special needs students. Sometimes we get them from the Office of Student Affairs and says, this is a special needs student, they'll need extra time. Well, just remember, second language writers may also need just a few extra minutes, especially for in-class assignments, to do that. They do have a limited English proficiency. And establish good rapport with all students, especially those who come from a second language, because what they really need is a friend. And sometimes when they come to this institution, for instance, they come from another country like Korea or Arabia or wherever, China, they come here and they all of a sudden are lost. They don't have that circle of friends that they used to. So they need the teacher to start becoming friends, have good rapport with them. Be willing to learn also about other languages and cultures. When they are trying to explain something from their language and culture, just be willing to listen, because we're always learning. We can learn from them just as they can learn from us. Any questions? I went really fast. Any questions?